Welcome to the Reaper's Den. If you would like to submit a story of your own, you can do so on the subreddit, TheReapersDenOfficial, or email me. Now, enjoy the stories. I had always wanted a place of my own, a sanctuary where I could paint and write without distractions. My psychiatrist said it would be healthy for me to have a new start. That's when I found a small, quaint house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. I thought I'd struck gold. The rent was unusually cheap, which should have been a red flag, but I was too excited to question it. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked, decorated, and started to settle in. It wasn't until the fourth night that I began to notice things. This house had an old, musty smell that seemed to come and go. And at night, I sometimes heard faint sounds, like whispers or shuffling. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. One evening, while exploring the basement, I discovered a door hidden behind an old bookshelf. It was heavily boarded up. Curious, I called the landlord, Mr. Thompson, and asked about it. His voice turned questionable. "What door in the basement?" he said. "You know, the one behind the bookshelf," I said hesitantly. "I've been through that house for years now, and I assure you there is no door." This struck me as odd, seeing as I was standing right in front of it. I figured he must have never noticed it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I spent the next few days prying the boards loose. Finally, with a creak and a groan, the door swung open, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. A chill ran down my spine as I peered into the void. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamed of a man in tattered robes, his face obscured by shadows. He stood in the center of a circle, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. The air around him shimmered with a malevolent energy, and his eyes, when they finally met mine, were empty, soulless. I woke up drenched in sweat, with my heart pounding. The nightmares became more frequent, more vivid. Each night the man seemed closer, his chants louder. I started hearing his voice even when I was awake, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to leak from the walls of the house. I found strange symbols drawn in the dust, and objects would move on their own. I was terrified, but every attempt to leave the house was stopped by an inexplicable force. The front door would refuse to open. I felt trapped. One particular night, I woke to find myself standing at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the darkness. I could hear the chanting again, louder this time, and the air felt thick. I wanted to run, but a force stronger than mine levitated my body as I unwillingly descended down the stairs. At the bottom, I found a hidden chamber lit by flickering candles. The man from my dreams was there, standing in the center of an elaborate ritual circle. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull. His eyes were sunken, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Welcome," he rasped. "I've been waiting for you." Before I could react, he began chanting again, and I felt an invisible force seize my body. I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The symbols on the floor began to be etched into my arms, and the room started to spin. Pain shot through me, as if my very soul was being torn apart. The last thing I remember was his laughter, echoing in my ears as everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw the marks on my arms. I tried to call for help, but no one answered. I was alone, isolated in this cursed house with the knowledge that I was no longer alone. The man in the basement was real. and he had claimed me as a part of his dark rituals. Days blurred into nights as my grip on reality slipped away. I could no longer distinguish between dreams and waking life. The chanting was constant now, a background hum that drove me to the brink of madness. I started to rip my hair from my head to try and ease my suffering until I felt a sharp pain in my neck. Dazed, I passed out, and when I came to, my psychiatrist was at my bedside. "How do you feel, Sarah?" she said softly. "Where am I?" I asked. She tilted her head and with a motherly tone said, "You're in your room here in the Institute. We thought we really lost you that time. Just try and relax, and everything will be fine." I've been in the institution for the last 3 years. The house, the basement, all of it was just in my head. Word of advice: careful which animal you feed in your mind. Mental health is a serious thing, and there is nothing wrong with getting help, because we all know nothing good ever comes from doing it alone. I first noticed it on my way home from work. The walk from the subway station to my apartment was always quiet, especially at 11 p.m. That night, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I shrugged it off as another late-night commuter. But when I turned the corner onto my street, the steps continued. The following night, it happened again, the same footsteps keeping pace with mine. I glanced back, but the dim streetlights revealed only shadows. I rushed my pace with my heart pounding in my chest until I made it to my apartment, the footsteps fading away as I locked the door behind me. The next night, I was on edge. I tried to rationalize it, but as soon as I stepped off the subway, I felt that familiar sense of dread. Instead of heading straight home, I took a detour to a friend's shop. The footsteps followed. Fear gripped me, and I picked up my pace, nearly jogging now. But the steps followed, almost matching mine. I broke into a full sprint, and I could hear them, so close behind me. I didn't dare look back. I came to the main road, where the street was busier, hoping the traffic and lights would deter whoever was following me. I slipped into my friend's shop, my hands shaking as I told him what was going on. I stayed there for what felt like hours, until my nerves calmed enough to head to my apartment. For the next few days, I took different paths home, leaving at different times. But no matter what I did, the footsteps were always there. Friends offered to walk with me, but I didn't want to put anyone else in danger. One night, as I neared my apartment building, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I spun around and came face to face with a stranger. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I didn't recognize him. "Stop running," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "It's no use." I tore myself free and ran for the door, fumbling with my keys. I barely managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly turn the lock. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I really didn't want to run into this guy again, but staying home just brought me no comfort. I felt as if I was trapped in my own home. I mean, this creep knows where I live. That night, I decided I couldn't live like this. I packed a bag and planned to stay with a friend until I figured it out. As I left my apartment, I heard an all too familiar sound. Halfway to the subway station, I walked as fast as I could without going in full sprint. Suddenly, a hand clamped over my mouth, pulling me into a dark alleyway. "Thought you could escape," the voice whispered. "No one ever does." I struggled and kicked and managed to break free, running blindly into the night. I didn't stop until I reached a police station, bursting through the doors, sobbing, "Someone, help," I begged. It took weeks of investigation, but they finally found him, a man with a history of stalking and assault. He'd been following me for months, always just out of sight, always just a step behind. Even after his arrest, I never truly felt safe. The memory of those footsteps haunted me, a constant reminder of the terror that had me on edge every day. I just hope I never see him again. I took the job at a fire watch tower to escape the chaos of city life. The promise of solitude in the wilderness was too tempting to pass up. The tower perched high on a ridge and offered a panoramic view of the dense forest below. It was exactly the kind of remote isolation I was after. The first few days were serene. The air was crisp, the landscape a vast sea of green. My only responsibilities were to keep an eye out for any signs of fire and to check in with the ranger station twice a day, along with recording weather reports. The cabin at the top of the tower was simple, but cozy, equipped with a bed, a stove, and my CB radio. On the fifth night, I saw it, a figure moving deep in the forest. Initially, I thought it might be a hiker, but there were no well-known trails in that area. I grabbed my binoculars and tried to get a better look, but the dense foliage made it impossible to make out what it was. I decided to make a note of it and mention it in my morning check-in. The next night, the figure returned, closer this time. An uneasy feeling crept over me. I felt my imagination and curiosity was getting the best of me. After all, being alone in the woods can play tricks on the mind. Still, I kept my binoculars close and watched until the figure disappeared into the trees. On the seventh night, the figure was moving up the ridge toward the tower. Anxiety gripped me. I radioed the ranger station, but all I got was static. I spent the night pacing in the cabin just thinking, what if it comes up here? The following night, the figure had reached the base of the tower. I could see it moving and circling the structure. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it below, hoping to scare off whoever or whatever was down there. The beam illuminated what appeared to be a man, but his stature and the way he dragged his arms around didn't seem human. A noise came from the woods, and this thing just took off. At this point, I had no idea what to do with myself. I felt like I was losing it. The next morning brought some peace, with the natural light leaking into the tower. I spent the day trying to reach fellow rangers with my CB, and all I could hear was the same static on every channel I had in my notebook. That night, the figure didn't just linger. It started to creep up the tower stairs. My heart pounded as I locked the cabin door and backed away, clutching a hunting knife that I always have with me for trips to the woods. That night, the figure didn't just linger. It started to creep up the tower stairs. My heart pounded as I locked the cabin door and backed away, clutching a hunting knife that I always have with me for trips to the woods. I heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs, slowly making its way up to the top. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I started to breathe as shallow as I could to remain quiet. I could hear what sounded like scratching of nails on dense wood. As I listened, I swore I could hear a woman crying in the distance. How could this be when it's right outside the door? I thought. Then it said simply in a woman's voice, "Help." I remained still and silent. "Help me," it said once more, sounding more clear. There was no way I'm opening that door or saying a word. For the third and last time it said, "Help, please." But this time it sounded off, like it was imitating something it had heard before, almost like it was recorded. After what I felt like hours, I could hear footsteps moving further away. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the knife and jumping at any creak the tower made. I got the courage to unlock the door and step outside. That's when I saw a brownish red drop of something on my boot. and as I looked around, I seen the freshly soaked scratches on the door. I radioed the ranger station, and this time, the response was immediate. "Morning, Jeff. Everything all right up there?" the ranger's voice said. I couldn't bring myself to explain what I had seen without sounding like I was going nuts. Instead, I muttered, "All good, just checking in." For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I slept with the lights on and the knife under my pillow. But there was no sign of the figure. I left the tower as soon as my rotation ended, returning to the city with a newfound appreciation for the noise and the crowds. Months later, I still think about the figure, the footsteps, the feeling of being hunted. I never told anyone the full story, fearing they'd think I was crazy, but I know what I saw and what I felt. The forest had a presence, something that didn't want me there. And some nights, in the quiet of my apartment, I still hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs. There was a man from my town named Thomas. He was a photographer and loved capturing the natural essence of nature and man-made things. He moved here about a year ago. He hadn't heard much about the dark tales of the one road that no local would ever dare travel down. The locals called it Dead End Road. It was a narrow, winding path, barely wide enough for a single car, lined with trees whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. At the end of the road, there was a tunnel. Its entrance held an unwelcoming darkness. Every year, one car would disappear down that road. No one knew why or how, but the pattern was undeniable. Legends grew about the tunnel. Some said it was a gateway to another world. Others claimed it was a trap set by restless spirits. One evening, Thomas, being skeptical of the stories, decided to investigate. As he drove, the trees seemed to close in, their twisted limbs scraping against the car. The headlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, but he pushed on until he reached the tunnel. He parked his car and stepped out, the cool air sending a chill down his spine. The tunnel loomed before him, an abyss that swallowed sound and light. As he approached the tunnel with his flashlight, it began to flicker against the damp stone walls. Halfway through, the flashlight dies. Panic surged through Thomas as he fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. In the pitch black silence, he heard whispers growing louder. They say those whispers sound that of a woman pleading for help. He turned to run, but the exit had vanished, replaced by endless, suffocating darkness. Thomas's screams echoed through the tunnel, but outside, the night remained eerily silent. His car was found abandoned at the entrance, its door wide open. The townsfolk shook their heads when they heard the news, adding another name to the list of the lost. To this day, there are about 50 known people that have gone missing in that tunnel. The legend of Dead End Road lives on, and the tunnel waited potentially for its next visitor. Now you're probably wondering how I know this story. See, I was a fearless boy that would ride my bike down that road just until I would reach the entrance. That's exactly what I did that day that Thomas had entered the tunnel. I'm 30 years old now, and I still hear his plea for help before silence came over the tunnel once again. We were a group of 6, celebrating Ben's last days of bachelorhood on his father's yacht, far off the coast. The sun had dipped down below the horizon, casting the ocean in a thick, inky darkness. We were all a bit tipsy, laughing and shouting, oblivious to the world around us. I remember thinking how perfect it was, how free we all felt out there, away from the constraints of our daily lives. That's when I heard the humming. It started off soft, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. I thought it was my imagination at first, or maybe one of the guys was playing a prank. But as the humming grew louder, it became clear it was something else. Something not quite human. "Do you hear that?" I asked, glancing around at my friends. They all stopped and listened. The laughter died down, replaced by a tense silence. The song was beautiful, hauntingly so. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It tugged at something deep inside me, pulling me towards the edge of the boat. "Where's it coming from?" Tom muttered, his eyes wide open. "I don't know," Ben said, standing up and peering into the dark water. "Maybe someone's out there." "Out here? In the middle of nowhere?" Paul scoffed, but there was fear in his voice. That's when we saw them, silhouettes in the water, just beyond the reach of our boat's lights. There were at least 4, maybe 5, all moving gracefully just beneath the surface. The humming grew louder, more insistent. It was hypnotic. "They're mermaids?" Ben whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make them disappear. Or worse, draw them closer. "No way," Tom said, but his voice was shaky. One of the figures broke the surface, revealing a woman's face, pale and beautiful, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. Her hair floated around her like a halo. She smiled at us, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was hungry. "We need to leave," I said, backing away from the edge. "Yeah, let's get out of here," Paul agreed, heading to the controls. But the engine wouldn't start. Paul cursed, trying again and again, but it was no use. The boat was dead in the water. The humming grew louder still, and now there were hands, pale, slimy hands, reaching up and grabbing at the sides of the boat. "We're not alone out here," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. "No shit," Ben replied, looking around frantically for anything we could use as a weapon. I grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit, my heart pounding. "Get back!" I shouted at the figures in the water. They didn't flinch. I fired the flare, and for a moment, the water was lit up bright red. What I saw then will haunt me for the rest of my life. They were everywhere, surrounding the boat, their glowing eyes, humming that now terrible song, and their teeth, rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "We're not getting out of this," Ben said with his voice trembling. "We have to try," I shouted. "We can't just—" But before I could finish, one of them leapt out of the water, grabbing Paul and pulling him overboard. His scream was cut short as he dragged under the water, churning red. We grabbed whatever we could, oars, poles, anything to fight them off. But they were too strong, too fast. One by one, they picked us off. Tom went, then next Dave. Ben and I were the last standing back to back, weapons in hand, waiting for the inevitable. "I'm sorry, man," Ben said, his voice barely audible over the humming. "Me too," I replied, my eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. Then they came for us. I felt something cold and slimy wrap around my ankle, pulling me down. I fought, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before I went under was Ben being dragged away, his face twisted in terror. The water was dark. I couldn't see anything. I felt them all around me, their hands pulling me deeper and deeper. I held my breath until my lungs burned, but eventually I had to breathe. The salt water filled my lungs, and everything went black. I woke up on the shore, coughing up seawater. The sun was rising, and the boat was nowhere in sight. I was alone, with no reason as to why I'm alive. The memory of those things and their terrible song still haunts me, and I know I'll never be able to forget the sound of their voices or the look in their eyes as they dragged my friends into the depths. They're still out there, somewhere in the dark water, waiting to prey on their next victims. And I know one thing's for sure: I'll never set foot on a boat again. The night air was thick with the hum of cicadas. As I sat on my front porch, nursing a cold beer, it was my ritual to unwind after a long day at the clinic, watching the fireflies flicker in the woods that edged my property. The moon cast a pale light over the trees, making the shadows dance and sway. I was about to head inside when a rustling in the bushes caught my attention. Probably a raccoon, I thought, or maybe a deer, but the sound was too deliberate. I squinted into the darkness, my breath hitching as I caught a glimpse of something moving. A flash of pale, almost luminous skin. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the cicadas seemed to go quiet. My pulse quickened, a cold chill seeping into my bones. I set my beer down and grabbed the flashlight from the porch table, shining it into the darkness. I stepped off the porch, my feet crunching on the gravel path as I approached the edge of the woods. I shined my light through the trees, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to turn back, the flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to slither along the ground. A whisper of movement to my left made me spin around. The light landed on a figure, humanoid, but not quite right. It was tall and gaunt, its skin almost translucent, with eyes that reflected the light of a cat's. I gasped, stumbling back a step. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an unnerving intensity. As I went to scream, a second figure emerged from the shadows and ripped the sound right out of my voice. Then a third. They moved with an unnatural grace, surrounding me silently. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't animals, and they certainly weren't human. One of the creatures stepped closer, reaching out with a thin arm. Its fingers were long and delicate, ending in sharp, claw-like nails. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I saw something glinting in the creature's other hand, a small, metallic device. A high-pitched noise filled the air, making me clap my hands over my ears. Panic surged throughout me, and I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, like crawling through quicksand. The noise grew louder, penetrating my skull, and I dropped to my knees with my vision blurring. As the darkness closed in, I felt myself being lifted. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the moonlight reflecting off the creature's unearthly eyes. When I awoke, I was lying in a field, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been put through a wringer. I sat up slowly, looking around in a daze. There was no sign of the creatures, no trace of their presence. I staggered back to my house. My mind was reeling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been somewhere else, that something had been done to me. As I reached my porch, I saw the metallic device lying on the ground where I had been taken. It was small, about the size of a matchbox, and it pulsed with a faint blue light. I picked it up hesitantly, feeling a strange warmth emanate from it. A flood of memories hit me then. Flashes of bright lights, strange symbols, and the creature standing over me, communicating in a language I couldn't understand. I dropped the device, stumbling back in horror. Whatever had happened that night, it was far from over. The creatures were out there, watching, waiting, and I knew deep down that they would be back. I don't expect anyone to believe me, and that's okay. It's my experience, and one that I'm fearful of reliving.